Good morning. My name is Helen Foss, today's worship associate. On behalf of First Unitarian Church of Wilmington, Delaware, I welcome you to our online worship service. We are a welcoming congregation. Welcome whoever you are, no matter the hue of your skin or the origin of your ethnicity. Wherever you are on your spiritual journey, or whomever you love, you are welcome here. It is good to be together. If you are new to First Unitarian, I encourage you to check out our website, firstuuwilm.org, to learn more about us and to sign up for our email newsletter. Our worship leader this morning will be UU minister, Reverend Tracey Robinson Harris. She's our temporary minister while Reverend Pam is taking a much-needed break. She will be telling us a story about Paul Robeson, a haunting story for me of a time when I was young, of borders and voices heard across lines. What can that mean for us today, in the month we are traditionally honoring the Reverend Martin Luther King? And now, let us prepare our hearts and minds for worship.
Our call to worship for this morning's service is by the Reverend Cynthia Landrum. Spirit of life and love, we gather as we are able this morning, ready to be of service to each other, to the world, ready to build the community of hope and of love. We are apart and we are together, offering our love, our commitment, our hope, and our prayers in service to one another and to this world. We gather as we are able in worship today.
If you have a chalice at home, I invite you to join me by lighting it. These words now this morning by Deborah Burrell. Fire consumes and casts a bright light. May our chalice flame consume our regrets for the past, our fears about the future, and our worries about today. May it light for us a path of joy and peace.
Come, thou fount of every blessing, tune our hearts to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. While the hope of life's perfection fills our hearts with joy and love, teach us ever to be faithful. May we still thy goodness prove. Come, thou fount of every vision, lift our eyes to what may come. See the lion and the young lamb dwell together in thy home. Hear the cries of war fall silent, fill our hopes glows like the sun. When we all serve one another, then our heaven is begun. Come, thou haunt of inspiration, turn our lives to higher ways. Lift our gloom and desperation, show the promise of this day. Help us bend ourselves in union, help our hands tell of our love. With thy aid, O fount of justice, earth be fair as heaven above.
Please join me in affirming our mission. First Unitarian Church of Wilmington is a beloved community that nourishes minds and spirits, fights injustice, and transforms the world through loving action.
Hi, everyone. Today, I'm going to share a story called Parting the Waters in a book called A Bucket Full of Dreams by Reverend Chris Weiss. In Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963, there were some children who wanted to be free. They were tired of being shut out of some restaurants, swimming pools, and playgrounds because of the color of their skin. They were tired of being treated unfairly because they were Black. They wanted to knock down the borders created to keep them separate. The children decided to march to protest the unfair treatment of Black people. And in May 1963, 3,000 children filled the streets to march for freedom. Many of these children were teenagers, but 6-year-olds marched as well. As the children marched, they could see a line of police officers blocking the street. There was a man with a megaphone yelling, "There will be no march today. I order you to turn back now." The children saw the border that was created to keep them from marching. They saw the clubs the police held and the mean-looking dogs on the end of leashes held by some of the police. They could also see that some men held high-powered fire hoses. At that moment, the children began to ask themselves, should we turn back? Is this a border we should not cross? But in the back of the children's minds, there was a story. It was a story they heard many times before. It was the story of Moses and how he led the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt to the shores of the Red Sea. The people were following Moses to freedom when they came to the shores of the Red Sea. "Now what do we do?" the people asked Moses. "Pharaoh and his soldiers are right behind us, and this great big Red Sea is right in front of us. Where can we go? Should we turn back?" Moses paused for a moment to pray. Then he stood up and held his head high, and he began to sing.
When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go.
Moses led the people forward and stepped into the Red Sea, and the waters parted. There was a wall of water to the left of him. There was a wall of water to the right of Moses, and the people walked to the other side. Then the waters came back together, leaving the soldiers behind. The children of Birmingham remembered the story of Moses, and it gave them hope. They knew that they too had come too far to turn back now. They imagined a better day without borders and obstacles. The children started marching again, right toward the line of police. The man with the megaphone could see that the children would not turn back, so he shouted to the police, "Turn on the fire hoses! Unleash the dogs!" The children marched and they sang.
As Israel stood by the waterside, let my people go. At God's command it did divide, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. When reach the other shore, let my people go. They sang a song of triumph o'er, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go.
The police officers looked at the children, they looked at each other, and they said no. As the children marched forward, the line of police parted, and the children marched on through. On that day, love conquered hate and fear, and the children of Birmingham moved closer to the promised land of freedom because they had the courage and faith to challenge obstacles and cross borders. The children of Birmingham, Alabama imagined a time when Black people would be treated fairly. They saw borders keeping them out of schools, playgrounds, and pools where only white children could go. They marched and worked to knock those borders down. I wonder what borders you have crossed. I wonder what borders you see in our country and in our community that need to be crossed. The children who marched were inspired by Martin Luther King Jr. and Bible stories. I wonder where Unitarian Universalists can find inspiration when we need to make tough decisions.
Our prayer this morning includes words from To Bless the Space Between Us by John O'Donohue. Please join now in the spirit of prayer and meditation. To all that is chaotic in you, let there come silence. Let there be a stilling of the voices that have laid their claim on you, that have made their home in you, that go with you even to the holy places, but will not let you rest, will not let you hear your life with wholeness, or feel the grace that fashioned you. Let what distracts you cease. Let what divides you cease. Let there come an end to what diminishes and demeans, and let depart all that keeps you in its cage. Let there be an opening into the quiet that lies beneath the chaos, where you find the peace you did not think possible and see what shimmers within the storm. Outrageous love. Now more than ever, we know the need for your steady presence. Be with us, whether we know you in the moment or not, for we need both outrage and love. Please join now in a brief time of shared silence. I invite you now to write in the chat the names of those who are in your hearts and minds this morning, the names of those who need our care and concern this day. May all those whose names were shared, and all who are in our hearts and minds, all those names unspoken, may all find peace and healing this day. The reading this morning is a poem entitled Cross That Line by Naomi Shihab Nye. Paul Robeson stood on the northern border of the USA and sang into Canada, where a vast audience sat on folding chairs waiting to hear him. He sang into Canada. His voice left the USA when his body was not allowed to cross that line. Remind us again, brave friend, what countries may we sing into? What lines should we all be crossing? What songs travel toward us from far away to deepen our days? In 1950, the U.S. State Department demanded that Paul Robeson surrender his passport unless he signed an affidavit denying that he was a communist. He refused. His passport was confiscated, and his right to travel and perform outside of the United States was gone. 2 years later, in January of 1952, Robeson and an attorney, Vincent William Halliman, who was working with labor leader Harry Bridges, Robeson and Halliman were prevented from crossing the border into Canada. They were en route to a meeting of the Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers Union in Vancouver, British Columbia, and American citizens were not required to carry passports to cross the border into Canada. Robeson and Halliman were prevented from crossing. Robeson still addressed the meeting of the union. He did so by telephone from Seattle, but the workers' union immediately began plans for a concert on the international border so that their members could hear the great baritone singer in person. 4 months later, in May of 1952, 30,000 people gathered on both sides of the United States-Canadian border at Peace Arch Park in Blaine, Washington. The stage was a temporary platform mounted on the back of a truck. The crowd sang, "O Canada," and the Star-Spangled Banner. The Canadian BC District News, which was a publication of the Workers' Union, described the scene. These are their words. When Robeson arrived, the great singer told his audience, "I can't tell you how moved I am today to see that nothing can keep me from my friends in Canada." He sang in English. He sang songs of peace in Russian and Chinese, and he sang songs of liberty in a tongue of the African villages, where his own people are now struggling to cast off the heel of their white exploiters. Robeson sang perennial favorites like Loch Lomond. He sang spirituals and songs protesting racial oppression, including "Every Time I Feel the Spirit" and "No More Auction Block." And he sang the labor song "Joe Hill," which was met with loud cheers from union members and the union-friendly crowd. He performed a passage from Othello, likely Othello's final speech. "Soft you, a word or two before you go." The concert concluded with Robeson singing "Old Man River," the showstopper he performed on both stage and screen in the Oscar Hammerstein Jerome Kern musical Showboat. In Showboat, "Old Man River" is sung by Joe, who works on a theatrical showboat in the Mississippi River in the 1880s. When singing this number in recital, Robeson always altered the lyrics to emphasize struggle rather than oppression. The original version of the song's final verse is, "I gets weary and sick of tryin'. I'm tired of livin' and scared of dyin'. But Old Man River, he just keeps rollin' along." Robeson sang, "I keeps laughin' instead of cryin'. I must keep fightin' until I'm dyin'. And Old Man River, he just keeps rollin' along."
There's an old man called the Mississippi. That's the old man I don't like to be. What does he care if the world's got troubles? What does he care if the land ain't free? Old Man River, that old man River, he must know something, but don't say nothing. He just keeps rolling, he keeps on rolling along. He don't plant potatoes, he don't plant cotton, and them that plants 'em is soon forgotten, but moon and river, he just keeps rolling along. You and me, we sweat and strain, body all aching and racked with pain. Tote that barge, lift that bale, you show a little grit, and your land's in a jail. Keeps laughing instead of crying. I must keep fighting until I'm dying. And old man River, he just keeps rolling along.
Paul Robeson stood on the northern border of the USA and sang into Canada, where a vast audience sat on folding chairs, waiting to hear him. He sang into Canada. His voice left the USA when his body was not allowed to cross that line. Remind us again, brave friend, what countries may we sing into? What lines should we all be crossing? What songs travel toward us from far away to deepen our days? Countries we sing into. Back then, brave souls were singing into this country, into these United States. Their songs had different rhythms and varied styles, some percussive, some soaring. And everyone singing and each song sung reminded this nation about a promissory note and a debt long owed. Before the dream was spoken on the Mall in Washington, D.C. that day, our national failure had been called out. In the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. The Declaration of Independence implied. The Emancipation Proclamation promised meaningful freedom to African Americans. That promise has never been fulfilled. Again, the words of Dr. King. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. Lines crossed. Back then, the lines had names, separate but equal: Jim Crow, the back of the bus, literacy test, poll tax, whites only, colored entrance. All the laws and schemes and plans and barriers, they had purpose: to hold those lines. And the people in power were intent on making sure the lines were not crossed, intent on making sure the promissory note would never be cashed. But those lines, they were not impermeable. They were not as strong as the people who would cross them. Yes, crossing them was dangerous, and they could be crossed. They could be broken. With preparation and strategizing and organizing, people crossed those lines. Paul Robeson, Thurgood Marshall, Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and many more. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, Viola Liuzzo, and many more. Like the children who were in the streets of Birmingham parting the waters in 1963. And many more. Organizers like Stacey Abrams and Latasha Brown, and thousands of Georgia's citizens of color, one more time, crossing the line to vote. To deepen our days. I have a personal story to share with you. It happened now about 2 decades ago. It happened during a visit I paid to the King Center in Atlanta. In the King Center, there is a sculpture of the highway from Selma to Montgomery. And on the highway are marchers of diverse identities. They are simply making their way down the road. Visitors come into the room and have the opportunity to read about the march, and they're invited to actually join the marchers on the highway. I read, and then I stepped on to that sculptured highway and stood with those marchers. I imagined what it might have been like, how they felt, what the road felt like beneath their feet. I imagined that, as so many did, and I am sure so many who were there came to this sculptured highway to remember. As I stood there on the highway, I heard a child's voice behind me. Is it okay for me to be here? I wasn't aware of anyone who had come into that space, so I turned around to see who was on the highway with me, who was behind me and had asked that question. And when I turned around, I saw a young African-American girl, about 10 or 11 years old, standing not too far away. She had asked the question, "Is it okay for me to be here?" Her question took my breath away. And I paused. And I thought to myself, who am I to answer her? And as that thought passed through, I said simply, yes, it's okay. It's okay for you to be here. Is it okay for me to be here? Remind us again, brave friend, of songs that travel toward us from far away to deepen our days. Remind us again, what lines should we be crossing?
Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land where I'm bound. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land where I'm bound. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land where I'm bound. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land where I'm found.
This is the time during our service when we take a moment to reflect on our stewardship for our beloved community. Stewardship, the careful and responsible management of something that has been entrusted into our care. My first thought is my responsible contribution of financial support to keep the lights on and the staff empowered to lead the church organization and our spiritual home. But there are many more ways than that. In deciding what to reflect on this morning, my mind immediately went to the impressive effort made by members of this church community to support the November election. Direct action on our fifth principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. So I want to give a shout out to those who seize this opportunity to act on that principle. In checking with First U member Becky Laster, who led our First U response, our denomination's UU the Vote initiative, I was blown away at the scope of our response. Becky co-leads the UU Delaware Advocacy Action, UDAN, that coordinated our statewide effort. She says more than 60 volunteers contributed to 30,700 postcards sent out to encourage the vote in the general election. These volunteers came from our statewide UU congregations here, Newark, Pike Creek, Dover, and Lewis, plus unaffiliated UUs, families and friends, and 22 other partner organizations who joined with us to publicize this and write postcards. From synagogues to Protestant and Catholic churches to groups like Indivisible. Then came the runoff election in Georgia. This time, 40-plus First Unitarians stepped up, and I was able to experience the process firsthand. Becky took my name and connected me with Jack Urin from the Milk Creek UU congregation, who oversaw the delivery of my bag of postcards, stamps, instructions, and the mailing list. First U member Barbara Kroll dropped the bag off at the front entrance of Cokesbury, where I live. And then I wrote 100 postcards out of the 16,000 total that were mailed to Georgia. I like to think that I had some very small part in the end result of the massive voter turnout. In any case, the whole UU The Voice project from First Unitarian netted an astonishing 46,700 postcards sent. Certainly, tangible evidence of our church community acting on our fifth principle, the right of conscience, and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. And this is only a report on the postcards and doesn't account for all of those of you who responded to the call for joining the phone banks. Thank you, each and every one of you who was sitting there smiling at home, knowing the important contribution you made in living out our fifth principle. Whether it was writing all those cards, organizing and or delivering the bags of cards, making those phone bank calls. Thank you for supporting our democratic process. So with great appreciation to the many ways our members live out our principles, I now ask each and every one of you to consider your financial support for our beloved community. You will see on your screen, and besides my image, the 3 ways you can make your contribution. You can mail your check to the church, you can go to the church website, or you can click on the donation page and use the Give Plus app on your phone, following the directions. Now, please join me in dedicating our offering. To the work of this congregation, which is weaving a tapestry of love and action, we dedicate our lives and these, our offerings.
Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Oh, don't you want to go to that gospel feast, that promised land where all peace. Oh, deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground.
Our closing words are by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They were included in an address he gave at New York City's Riverside Church on April 4th of 1967, a year to the day before he was assassinated. His address is called Beyond Vietnam, Time to Break the Silence. These are Dr. King's words. We are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world.
These words for extinguishing our chalice are from Maddie Cefantis. We extinguish this flame, but we keep its light in our hearts with its message of love and justice, taking it outside these walls to the world we live in until we gather together again.